Hello everyone, welcome to another interesting and informative session of The Analyst brought to you by Bajiram and Ravi. In today's session, we will discuss 7 important articles as featured in the Hindu and Indian Express for your comprehensive understanding of the current affairs explained to you in the easiest language possible. The topics are as follows. From your analysis section, which also provide you the much important avenue to practice daily answer writing, in the first topic, we are going to cover the issue of inclusive pension system which lacks in our country and what can be the suggestive way forward. Then in the second topic, we are going to deal with the issue of deforestation which is taking place in the region of Western Ghat and Aravallis and what are the steps which has been taken by the government for the afforestation purposes. Then we will take 5 topics in your simplified section. We will not only try to simplify the news for you but also provide you the much important value addition keeping in mind the approaching May 2025. So stay tuned. The lead editorial today highlights the issue of lack of pension coverage of silver economy in the country and provides us the suggestive measures which shall be taken. What is this concept of silver economy? How does our pension ecosystem in our country looks like? All of that forms an important component of your GS2 paper under the larger theme of government policies and interventions. The idea is that when we have worked in any particular sector for even a short duration of time, you guys might have realized the importance of pension which is given after the person is retired or the working age of the particular person is over. This particular pension forms an essential component to actually ensure the financial stability as well as the dignity of the individual. And this particular population which actually gets over the age of 60 years is exactly what is termed as the concept of silver economy. So if we refer to the National Policy on the Older Population 1999, it basically describes a elderly population to actually consist of the people who have become the age of 60 years and above. So it is obvious that we do not have such a uniform retirement policy in all the sectors. It will obviously vary from sector to sector. In the government sectors, it can vary from 60 years to 65 years. For example, in the case of High Court and Supreme Court judges. The idea is that all of this particular people who actually have gone above the age bracket of 60 years, as per the recently released World Population Report 2025, which has been released by UNFPA, it tells us that how currently 10 to 12% of our population is actually above the age of 60 years or fall in this category of elderly population. And as per the estimation, this population of 134 million, which was back in the year of 2020, is actually going to reach a staggering number of 300 million in 2050 itself. Keep this in mind that this elderly population itself is actually reaching the current size population of Mexico and Russia. And when we are saying that there will be estimated 300 million people who are above the age of 60 years, that is almost going to the equal to the population of USA in the year of 2018. So by the year of 2050, the World Population Report suggests that 18% of our total population, almost 1/5, is actually going to be in the age bracket of retirement. The World Bank also says that this particular population who has actually crossed the age of 60 years has a huge economic potential. And this basically constitutes the idea of silver economy. Basically, the economic activities, the goods, the services which caters to the need of elderly population. So for example, the insurance scheme which we were discussing in the last discussion, or for example, the healthcare services, the medicines, the various kind of infrastructure, all of that. That basically forms the concept of silver economy, which is estimated to be worth around 73,000 crore. And the annual spending power of this particular age bracket is actually going to increase by 103% within this decade itself. Also, the concept of silver economy is integral to the concept of women empowerment because currently the silver economy constitutes 42 million more women than men. Our constitution has also taken into the cognizance to provide the pension or to provide some kind of public assistance to this elderly population as a directive principle to the state policy under Article 41 of the Constitution, which specifically directs the state to ensure public assistance in the case of unemployment, in the case of sickness, in the case of old age or for example disablement. These specific 4 terms has been mentioned. So when we have understood the importance of silver economy, the idea is that what are the issues which this silver economy is facing. The first and foremost is the rising dependency ratio. So normally in most of the sectors, the age of 60 years is actually considered to be the age of retirement. Unless and until obviously if you are working in the highest office of the country, that is Parliament, which basically makes the law for the whole nation altogether. But the idea is that you can work indefinitely in the Parliament. So basically the concept is that if you get into the Parliament, you will start getting younger altogether. There you don't require that much of efficiency. Obviously in some small IT company, the efficiency is much more required. So the person shall be retired by the age of 60 years so that the younger demographic dividend can come into the play. The point is that when we are saying that 18% of our population by the year of 2050 is actually going to be more than the age of 60 years, don't you think that they will act as a kind of a dependent population on our demographic dividend? The demographic dividend, which basically constitutes of the population in the working age between 15 to 59 years. So let's say for example, this 15 to 59 years population is actually incurring an income of 100 rupees. We can estimate that almost 18 rupees of that income will actually go towards healthcare services, taking care of this elderly population altogether, thus not translating into the efficient capital generation which one might expect. Why this population is actually going to become so much dependent on the working age population is because of the concept of the lack of job avenues, and that is basically arising because of the emergence of Industry 4.0 and Industry 5.0, which is basically going to work upon the concept of artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data analytics. So it is obvious that because of these factors, there is going to be much more mechanization and automation in the industry. That will obviously lead to the kind of job layoffs. At the same time, with this kind of increasing reliance on technology, when we talk about the kind of technology accumulation among this specific generation who has gone above the age of 60 years, that is something where there lies a kind of a IRSO mismatch or a industry required skill offered mismatch. To understand this concept, let's take the example of a person called as Hayao Miyazaki. Hayao Miyazaki actually made in the news recently because of his Ghibli art, which actually became a kind of a global phenomenon. So when Miyazaki invented Ghibli art, it took him years of an effort. And this same Ghibli art, such as for example of a scene from Sholay or a scene from Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge, can be created by ChatGPT using artificial intelligence in the matter of seconds. Thus basically the kind of the skill set which some artisans of Ghibli might have developed over the years, that has completely made obsolete by this technology altogether. And that is exactly what Miyazaki termed as an insult to life. So there exists a kind of industry requirement of skills of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and the skill which is being offered by this particular age bracket. Let's take another example. Let's say for example there is a particular artisan who is working for generations to create a handmade pottery. Now the idea is that this particular person would be quite inadequately capitally supported to actually integrate the technology of 3D printing. The concept of 3D printing, which can be utilized to create the same pottery with much better design, with less cost of input, with less amount of labor and thus less cost. However, to make this traditional artisan is skilled in this concept of 3D printing, that is going to be a major challenge, and that is the issue of reskilling altogether. For example, we have been frequently discussing about a scheme called as Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, which aims to skill the population to make them kind of industry ready. The idea is that in this Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana's corpus, only 5 to 10% of the population is actually above the age of 60 years who has enrolled to get skilled. And thus, is it going to lead to a kind of a large scale unemployment among this population and thus wasting of the silver economy? The idea is yes. This is exactly what we can see here, that how the 24% of the elderly actually face restrictions to the activities of daily living. 23% has prevalence of multi-morbidity, so obviously they are having a kind of an high out-of-pocket expenditure when it comes to their health expenses and thus making them more reliant on the demographic dividend. Then 22% of the elderly face poverty and 19% of elderly did not had any source of income. This proportion was actually above the national level among 17 states, ranging from 19.3% in Uttarakhand to almost 42.4% in the Union Territory of Lakshadweep. So when we have understood the kind of the wastage of silver economy which can be done, or for example, the kind of unemployment which this particular silver economy faces, don't you think that providing them an adequate social security net becomes imperative for our country? Now let's try to assess the status of this social security net as per the Economic Survey 2025 to 2026, which basically tells us that how, when it comes to the kind of provision of social security net to this population, the Indian pension asset constitutes only 17% of the GDP. However, it is as high as 80% coverage in the advanced economy. At the same time, only 12% of the total working population is actually adequately enrolled in any kind of formal pension system altogether. And even in this 12% of the total working force, the major constitutory is obviously home, the public sector jobs and the much organized private sector jobs, thus largely leaving the informal sector, which constitutes the largest section of our economy, completely devoid from any kind of social security net. Because for this informal sector workers, there is only a kind of a voluntary coverage if they want to enroll under the National Pension Scheme or Atal Pension Yojana. And that is the reason that a global report from consulted firm Mercer, which has also been quoted in the today's editorial, it has placed India last in its evaluation of retirement system in 40 countries, where our overall rating was 40.3, while the global average exists at 60.5. The problem areas were identified: the need to integrate the minimum level support for at least the poorest aged, the need to increase coverage specifically in the unorganized sector, the need to introduce minimum access age for the retirement funds, and also to improve the requirement regulation for the private sector pension funds. When we talk specifically about the informal sector basically constitutes almost 85% of the total employment in our country, which basically generates almost 50% of the GDP. For example, if you are focusing upon the rural area, that how much population in the rural area is actually covered under the pension scheme, we can assess that fact by analyzing the informal sector people or the workforce which is working in the sector of agriculture, forestry and fishing, that is 97% unorganized or informal sector. 86% in the context of trade, repair, food services, 74% in construction, 52% in real estate and almost 47% in other services. Now, how, in the absence of this social security net, how this particular population which is working in the unorganized sector, how they get affected? Let's take an example of the case study of pandemic. So when pandemic took place, it actually brought our economy to a standstill for almost 2 years. That led to a kind of a mass scale disruption of specifically the micro, small and medium enterprises, which basically constitutes this informal sector workers, the gig workers, the platform workers, like for example the workers who are working for the app deliveries like such as your Swiggy or Zomato, etc. So as per the data which was released by the Reserve Bank of India itself, this micro, small and medium enterprises, to stay afloat, almost 2/3 of them actually kind of integrated the job layoffs, and almost 25% of them completely shut down, obviously because of the less demand which was being created by the economy at that point of time. And even till today, they have not been able to significantly recover because of the kind of the K-shaped recovery which has followed after the pandemic, such as for example the status of textile sector. So the idea is that because of all of this, don't you think that there was a kind of a mass scale job layoff following the pandemic, and thus a large section of these unorganized workers were completely unemployed and at the same time completely derived of any kind of social security net altogether. In this context, the government intervened and issued the Social Security Code 2020, which was also asked in your mains examination of 2024, where the government said that okay, now the central pension schemes such as for example Jeevan Jyoti Bima Yojana, Pradhan Mantri Suraksha Bima Yojana, Matru Vandana Yojana, all of this under this corpus of Social Security Code 2020 can now be extended to the informal sector worker as well. The major initiative in this regard was Pradhan Mantri Shram Yogi Mandhan, which was a specific pension scheme for unorganized worker. By study of this scheme itself, we will try to identify the issues which prevails in provision of pension to the informal sector. First and foremost, note down that how this scheme is completely voluntary and contributory pension scheme. So it's not like that if I'm an informal worker, unless and until I myself is not going to avail the pension scheme, I will not get benefit of that for sure. At the same time, don't you think there exists a lack of financial literacy among the Indians? So we are completely unaware about how to plan our careers, how to earn a significant portion, how to save a significant portion of that and create a corpus for our future needs. So in the absence of that financial literacy, don't you think that a large section of unorganized sector workers, they will not be enrolled in this Shram Yogi Mandhan altogether? Then what it offers a minimum monthly pension of 3,000 rupees after the age of 60 years. That also basically means that you have kind of formalized the date of retirement altogether. What if someone wants to work beyond that or wants to retire before that? Third, it specifically caters the need of informal sector only to those sectors who have a monthly income of 15,000 rupees. So what about, let's say for example, a rickshaw puller who is earning daily wages of 200, 300 rupees and thus at the end of the month is only earning 10,000 rupees. Is that person covered under this corpus? Absolutely not. Then just look at the staggering number of the people who have registered on the eShram portal, and that is 30 crore informal workers. The scheme is basically being monitored by the Ministry of Labour and Employment. That is why today's article basically suggests that how India needs a kind of tier-wise pension system where we have provided a kind of a specific set of different packages to meet the need of the diverse society which we have. And for that purpose, it has provided us certain global best practices, such as for example, the case of Japan. Japan basically allows for a mandatory flat rate contributory scheme for all residents irrespective of their income criteria between the age of 20 to 59 years. So if you are a farmer in Japan, if you have a kind of a ration shop in Japan, or for example if you are an IAS officer, all of you are covered under this mandatory flat rate contributory pension scheme. The same concept has been applied by New Zealand as well, which provides universal flat rate public pension not only to citizens but to the residents who are aged above the 65 years. The only requirement is that you might be residing in the country of New Zealand for at least 10 years. Then Australia has actually taken steps to increase the financial literacy among the people. The school curriculum in Australia actually incorporates a superannuation planning classes altogether from the school level itself. And when we are talking about this voluntary concept, United Kingdom has completely removed it. UK has done what? It basically provides for participation by default. So if you will start earning, a certain portion from your earnings will be automatically debited to go into your pension account, unless and until you choose to opt out. So these are the global best practices which we can implement as well. And thus the ideal way forward can be to harmonize our fragmented schemes into a kind of a tiered system, which can also be designed on the kind of the various income brackets. So obviously for the lower income bracket, we can actually kind of target to provide much more pension provision and much more pension corpus. Second, there shall be a mandatory basic pension guarantee at a kind of a flat rate, irrespective of any kind of income criteria. In this particular case, what we can do, we can actually provide mandatory pension debiting, unless and until the person kind of chooses to opt out. For this purpose, we can actually enroll the employer-based schemes with auto-enrollment. Then further incentivization can be provided through tax benefits if you have availed any kind of pension scheme, to provide these pension scheme with market linked returns instead of a kind of a fixed return, and also providing various kind of flexible products. Ultimately, we can focus upon the increasing of financial literacy campaigns in schools and colleges. So keep the whole pension infrastructure in your mind, keeping in mind the approaching prelims mains 2025, and also try to attempt this particular question. We move forward to the next news. where the Ministry of Environment has actually revamped the Green India mission to tackle the massive scale deforestation which is taking place in the mountain ranges of Aravallis and Western Ghats. This concept of deforestation forms an important component of your GS3 paper under the larger theme of environment conservation. So let's start our discussion by understanding the geographical distribution as well as the biological importance of these two mountain ranges, that is Western Ghats and Aravallis. Western Ghats, which are also called as Sahyadri or the Great Escarpment of India, because of its volcanic origin, actually extends to 6 states. So it basically starts from the state of Maharashtra, Gujarat, Maharashtra, then comes Karnataka, Goa, your Kerala as well as your Tamil Nadu. Keep this in mind that the largest extent of Western Ghat actually lies in the state of Karnataka, and this particular Western Ghat actually meets Eastern Ghat at a specific place, and that is called as Nilgiri Hills. The highest mountain range in the Western Ghat is your Anaimudi, which is around 2695 meter tall. So these Western Ghat expanding to these 6 states is actually around 1600 plus kilometer long. It starts from south of Satpura range. So it starts from your Tapi estuary and extends up to Kanyakumari in the south. It is mostly a contiguous and a continuous mountain range, but it has 3 important gaps called as Goa Gap, Palghat Gap and your Shen Kotta. Because of the kind of biodiversity it possesses. So for example, Western Ghats basically is home to 30% of the total flora and fauna of our country, out of which almost 60% is endemic. Basically means that this flora and fauna is found only in the region of Western Ghat and nowhere else, thus making it one of the 36 biodiversity hotspots in the world. Also making it one out of 43 UNESCO World Heritage Sites which we have. The same Western Ghats are also the kind of the source for the perennial rivers like for example Godavari, Kaveri, Krishna, etc. You guys might have heard about in the news about the repeated appearance of the kind of the dispute which is taking place along the Kaveri river. The Kaveri river water sharing dispute which lies between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. At the same time, remember that these particular Western Ghats has a very important role as they form the major watershed in the peninsular India. So when the southwest monsoon arrives and hits the India's western coast, these Western Ghats, these mountain ranges basically act as a kind of a watershed, ensuring that major rainfall take place in this region. They also act as a major contributor in the carbon sequestration. So for example, 4 million tons of carbon is sequestrated by this Western Ghat range every year, and that basically constitutes 10% of the emission which is neutralized by India's total forest altogether. Then we have Aravallis, one of the oldest kind of geological feature on the planet Earth itself, as they were created in the Proterozoic era, which basically took place 530 million years ago. They basically expands to 3 states, the 3 states being your Haryana, Rajasthan and Gujarat, and one union territory, that is the National Capital Territory of Delhi. They are around 670 km long. The highest peak in the range of Aravalli is Guru Shikhar at the Mount Abu. The major river system which basically originates from this Aravalli range is your Luni, Sabarmati and Banas. And it also, just like Western Ghats, constitutes a major biodiversity hotspot with various wildlife corridors such as for example Sariska Delhi Leopard Wildlife Corridor. However, both of these mountain ranges are actually facing the large scale issue of deforestation. The article basically highlights one of the major reasons for that is the commercial exploitation which is taking place in these mountain ranges due to the growing economic hunger. So for example, when you are talking about the Western Ghats, they act as a rich source for minerals like iron, bauxite, manganese. Here keep this in mind that Karnataka has India's largest magnetite iron ore reserves in the country. And thus there is a massive illegal mining which is taking place along these 2 mountain ranges. Such as for example, just look at the article here, that how 7.6% of the total forest land in the Aravallis has already been flattened between 1975 to 2019. And by the year of 2059, almost 1/5 of the total Aravalli mountain ranges consisting of forest is completely going to be lost altogether. Just look at the number of the illegal mining which is taking place in the region of Aravallis. All of that is leading to what? The desert-like conditions which will expand from the Thar desert in the Rajasthan towards the North India, including Delhi NCR. The sandstorms will actually become more frequent, and obviously the loss of wildlife habitat and indigenous flora and fauna which will take place. Another major reason beside this illegal mining is the plantation of commercial crops in this region. For example, growing of your rubber, tea, coffee, etc. in the region of Western Ghat, and the unchecked livestock grazing which takes place. Then obviously, if the world population report says that we have become a country of 146 crore people, so there is a huge anthropogenic pressure on these natural ecosystems. Why? Because of the rapid urbanization, creation of dams, creation of various infrastructure for the needs of the human beings. And all of that is leading to this massive scale of deforestation, which is ultimately translating into what? First of all, the loss of fertile soil cover. So if the fertile soil cover is already gone, right, the fertile soil cover which is actually created, let's say for example, because of the degeneration of these trees, leaves, etc., thus providing the ingredient humus for the kind of the rich organic matter which is present in the soil, which act as the nutrients for the other crops. Or for example, how these trees, they actually kind of hold the soil altogether, thus ensuring that this topmost fertile soil layer does not wash away in the floods, etc. But now if this forest is gone itself, the loss of fertile soil cover is taking place. And don't you think that will basically translates into what? The decline of food productivity altogether, thus compromising our food security. At the same time, these trees, they act as what? A major carbon sequestration engines. So basically there is going to be a loss of sink of CO2, thus more increasing of the greenhouse gases, thus more increasing of the global warming which we are already facing, and that is leading to loss of habitat and wildlife as well. Another major role played by these trees are that they have these roots which go under the soil and reaches to the groundwater level, from where this water is actually brought to the trees, and ultimately the trees provide moisture to the surrounding environment in the form of transpiration. But now if we just completely kind of eliminate this tree altogether, don't you think that this underground water cannot be evaporated anymore altogether? Thus there will be the release of moisture will be less. These atmospheric rivers will be lost. The loss of precipitation, less rainfall, more drought-like condition, more loss of vegetation, wildlife, flora and fauna. So what is the status? What is the status of the forest when it comes to our country? So for that purpose, let's refer to the India State of Forest Report 2023, according to which the total forest and tree cover in our country stood at 25.7% of the total geographical area. However, if we refer to our National Forest Policy 1988, it envisaged an ambitious target that at least 33% of the total geographical area of the country, that is 1/3, shall be within the forest cover. So we are still lagging quite far behind than that target. And if we talk about that from the year of 2021 to the year of 2023, how much forest area which we have kind of added. So you guys might have seen that for every dot ball in the IPL, the BCCI was saying that we are planting trees altogether. If they really wanted to plant so much trees, they could have actually put the tree plantation to runs altogether, because obviously there will be less dot balls in the IPL, a T20 format. So the idea is that with all of these efforts which are being taken, how much area we added to the forest cover, that was a huge number of 156 km square. The states which we have kind of addressed, the largest decrease in the forest cover includes your Madhya Pradesh, Karnataka, Ladakh, Nagaland, the highest being in Madhya Pradesh. The reason of decline as per the Indian State of Forest Report itself is your shifting cultivation, the kind of the jhum cultivation which is kind of practiced by the tribals, the encroachment of land because of the urbanization, creation of industries, or for example creation of dams, the natural calamities which are kind of rising more and more, the forest fire, flash flood, as well as kind of transgressing of land or providing this land and clearance of it which is being taken place by the tribals under the Forest Right Act of 2006. At the same time, the economic reasons remains, such as for example the use of timber industry. The states which still remains with the largest forest cover, that is Madhya Pradesh with the highest, followed by Arunachal Pradesh and Chhattisgarh. The carbon stock which we have been able to reach, that is 7,285 million tons. If we take 2005 as a kind of a base year, then we have added almost 2.5 billion tons of CO2 sequestration. So that is basically we are quite close to the 3 billion ton target which we took for ourselves under the Glasgow commitment. The highest such carbon sequestration which is being done by the trees comes from the state of Arunachal Pradesh. So what are the steps which government has taken to kind of improve the afforestation, specifically in these two regions? First and foremost is declaration of ecologically sensitive area under the section 3 of the Environment Protection Act of 1986, under which the government has prohibited certain activities in these forested regions, such as for example commercial mining, commercial use of timber, creation of any kind of polluting industry, major hydroelectric projects. Major hydroelectric project basically means more than 25 megawatt, discharge of solid waste into the river ecosystem to ensure the ecological flow. Certain activities are regulated, such as for example felling of trees, establishment of recreational infrastructure like hotels for tourism, commercial use of natural water, creation of underground cables, or drastic changes in cropping patterns. Keep this in mind for your prelims purposes as well. Then there is also a proposal to create a kind of a green wall, as a kind of a green wall which is being created in Africa. Can anybody tell in the comment box from which country to which country? So a similar kind of a green wall the government of India is also envisaging to create in the region of Aravallis, which will be around 1400 km, which will actually extend from Porbandar to Panipat, covering the entire Aravalli range. This will actually act as a kind of a barrier from the dust from west and check the eastward march of Thar Desert which is taking place by restoring the degraded land through massive afforestation exercise. However, it has not yet got a formal nod. Beside that, the major mission which is in the news today, that is Green India Mission, which is one of the 8 key missions under the National Action Plan for Climate Change, which was launched in the year of 2014 as a centrally sponsored scheme. The idea was to increase the forest cover on 5 million hectares of a forest and non-forest land, and then further improve the quality of the existing forest in additional 5 million hectares of the forest land, to kind of ensure livelihood for 3 million people who are directly dependent upon the forest, and at the same time to enhance the carbon dioxide sequestration by these trees by 60 million tons by 2030. Sounds very good on the paper, but what is the actual status? For example, the target of creation of such trees in the area wise, it was around in Uttarakhand, the target was around 6,440 hectares of the forestation which shall be done where in Uttarakhand. What we have achieved? 1,500 hectares out of that. Similarly, let's say for example in Madhya Pradesh, it was 5,858 hectares we were envisaging. How much we have achieved? 1,880. So it's obvious that even under this Green India Mission, we have been unable to kind of meet our targets, and thus the article today provides for certain suggestive measures. First and foremost is that yes, obviously as the population is increasing, the food demand is going to increase as well. The urbanization will also increase. So these are something which we cannot control completely. What we can rather do to integrate the forestry with these two aspects. For example, in the rural areas, we can practice the concept of agroforestry. So to create a kind of a channels of trees and crops along with each other. Similarly, urban afforestation can be taken place under the Miyawaki method. Then we can also kind of use the concept of accredited compensatory afforestation, which was basically provided under the Forest Conservation Act of 2023. What is this concept? So let's say for example, you are a farmer in the region of Uttarakhand, and you had 1 hectare of land, right, which was lying kind of a waste, and you created a kind of a 1 hectare of forest here. Then let's say for example, in the far down south in the state of Tamil Nadu, there is an industry which wants to create a kind of a new plant for let's say iron production, and for that purpose they have to clear 1 hectare of forest. So this particular industry in Tamil Nadu can actually purchase this 1 hectare of forest land in Uttarakhand to kind of compensate for that under the Compensatory Afforestation Fund Management and Planning Authority. That is the concept of accredited compensatory afforestation in the Forest Conservation Act of 2023. Then we can also implement the recommendation of Gadgil Committee specifically in the context of Western Ghat. For example, It recommended that at least 1/3 or 33% of the area of Western Ghats shall be declared as ecologically sensitive area. Not only polluting industry, but any kind of industry shall be completely prohibited to be creation in the region of Western Ghat. At the same time, the existing industry shall also be kind of zoned out by the year of 2030. Then we can also kind of incorporate the indigenous communities who have much better knowledge when it comes to the kind of the afforestation which shall be done, and for that purpose we can actually look at the model of 2 billion trees program which has been deployed by Canada. The government has also taken several steps. For example, integrated development of wildlife habitat, Nagar Van Yojana, as well as mangrove initiatives for shoreline habitats and tangible income called as MISTI program. So remember all of these initiatives in your mind, try to attempt this particular question, and we move forward to the next news, where we are going to discuss a very interesting concept, the concept of the language of inclusion, the evergreen debate that shall India have a common language. The idea is that let's first try to understand that what does the article tries to emphasize today. It says that it is universally acknowledged that young children learn best through their mother tongue. And the same has also been cited in the research which has been conducted under the National Education Policy 2020, which basically states that children pick up language extremely quickly between the age of 2 to 8 years. And it promises that all languages will be taught in an enjoyable and interactive style with plenty of interactive conversation. The idea is that from where this concept of one nation, one language actually originates from. It originates from the annals of history, specifically from the debate called as Orientalist versus Anglicist debate. So when the Britishers established their political power in our country through the Battle of Plassey and Battle of Buxar, they eventually started pondering upon a question how to kind of administer this particular population about whose religious policy, about whose customs, beliefs, traditions, about any of this they don't have any iota of an idea. At the same time, they cannot speak our language as well. So how to rule this particular population? Let's say, for example, I tell you that we have kind of acquired a particular territory in Kenya, a small territory only. And at this stage, we have kind of come across a tribe called as Maasai tribe, which lives in Kenya. We don't have any knowledge about the language, custom and tradition of this Maasai tribe. So I ask you guys as my officers that what we shall do. Warren Hastings, Lord Cornwallis, what we shall do. You guys actually suggest that we shall follow a policy called as policy of ring fence. Basically to sit and not interfere in the customs and traditions of the natives. Rather try to learn their languages, their culture, their education system. That is the reason, for example, there is creation of your Calcutta Madrasa under Warren Hastings in the year of 1784. Or for example, the creation of a Sanskrit university under Lord Cornwallis in the year of 1791. Or for example, the purpose why Lord Wellesley in 1800 creates Fort William to actually kind of train the European civil servants into Indian customs and traditions. But then by the year of 1813, the geopolitics has changed. The Britishers has acquired almost the whole country altogether. From the year of 1803, the Mughal emperor has become the pensioner of the Britishers. From the 1802, the signing of Treaty of Bassein, it has basically led to all the Maratha power kind of coming into the subsidiary alliance system of the Britishers altogether. The Tipu Sultan has been defeated down in the south. The states like Hyderabad and Awadh had actually become a kind of a dependent state or buffer states for the Britishers. So from 1813, the policy of ring fence changes to the policy of paramountcy. And now they start imposing their language, their culture on our country. Starting from a book called as History of British India, which was actually written in the year of 1817 by James Mill, where he divided the Indian history into 3 parts, very categorically, into a Hindu rule, Muslim rule, and not a Christian rule, rather British rule, where it said that how the Britishers has a kind of a responsibility to educate the Indians. It also said that the Indian literature, which consists of various vernacular languages, regional languages, all of that is full of unscientific thought, religious superstition and dogmatism. And the biggest propounder of introduction of English as a language was Thomas Macaulay, the first law member which was basically introduced to the Viceroy Executive Council at that point of time by the Charter Act of 1833. So the Governor General's Executive Council, the law member was Thomas Macaulay. And he basically stated that I have travelled across the length and breadth of India and I have not seen one person who is a beggar. I do not think we would ever conquer this country unless we break the very backbone of this nation, which is her spiritual and cultural heritage. Also, thus what we need to do, we need to replace this country's old and ancient education system and the culture. For if the Indians think that all that is foreign, hear this very carefully, all that is foreign and English is good and greater than their own, they will eventually lose their self-esteem, their native self-culture, and they will become what we want them to become, a truly dominated nation. And that is exactly what happened through the Macaulay's Minute of 1835 and Charles Wood Dispatch of 1854. Where Macaulay held that how a single shelf of European library was worth the whole native literature of India, and how they were required to spread language and culture of the ruling class and the language of commerce. For this purpose, English Education Act of 1835 was enacted, which said that from now onwards the medium of instruction for higher education was going to be English. Do they have this much of resources to create colleges across the country? Absolutely not. Do they want to spend by doing this as a kind of a public funding? Absolutely not. They are here under the policy of British mercantilism to make profits. Thus, they devised a theory called as downward filtration theory. So, for example, first of all, you look into social media. You see rich people wearing some bags or carrying some bags of rich brands like Gucci and Prada. 2 days, 3 days down the line, you find the same copy of the bag at a much cheaper cost, right, in some local market. Right? Downward filtration. Similarly, if you go into the villages, people are not wearing Puma, they are wearing Pumba, right? The Adidas has become Adibas. That is basically what the downward filtration theory. We will teach the elites, and over a course of period, through their books, languages, development of various literature, they will pass this knowledge to the kind of the mass population, which basically lies in the fold of poverty. Macaulay specifically categorized the economics of English, that how by this they will be able to connect the Indian economy into the world, develop the taste for British product and use these English speaking Indians as clerks, as at the subordinate positions in the administration. Through Charles Wood Dispatch, a 3-tier structure was envisaged. In the primary school, vernacular language, the language which you speak. In secondary school, English will be introduced. But if you want your children to get the higher education, to get certain jobs under the British administration, only English will be taught at the college level. So obviously what will happen? The people will start teaching their kids in English language from the primary school altogether. The universities were now going to be on the model of universities in London. There was going to be an education department in every state and at least one government school teaching in English in every district, where there was going to be a promotion of women education. And they destroyed our Gurukul and Madrasa system which prevailed through this grant in aid system. They said, do you want the Britishers to create infrastructure for you, to provide you kind of grants to sustain? For that purpose, we are going to provide you grants, but only if you are going to follow the curriculum which is provided in English by the Britishers. So we will be teaching you what we want to teach you, rather you will not have any option to kind of choose the subject of your interest. And that is exactly what happens. You guys think that you have been learning the subject of your interest, but that never happened. There was a curriculum which was imposed upon you. You never chose the subject of your interests. Thus, when we got independent, again, this language issue became a kind of a national furor. Remember that we will take the kind of a definition which we are discussing recently as well by the Supreme Court judgment in UP Sahitya Sammelan versus State of UP, which specifically said that in India there is no national language. Yes, but we do have official language, and that was basically categorized with the Munshi Iyengar formula. So under Article 343 of the Constitution, Hindi in the Devanagari script was considered as an official language. But because of the kind of the huge furor which it caused in the other states, like for example in Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Kerala, it was adopted that English will also be considered as an official language for next 15 years since the adoption of the Constitution. But at the same time, you guys can see that how there was a kind of a huge kind of a protest which was taking place to create linguistic based states altogether. There was a complete kind of a movement which was being launched so that the Hindi imposition on the southern states does not take place. And for that purpose, the Official Language Act 1963 was enacted, which basically provided for the continued use of English indefinitely altogether. So in this aftermath, when Kothari Commission 1966 was created, it recommended for a 3-language formula, which was also adopted in the National Policy on Education 1968 and has been continued in the National Education Policy 2020, where the first language which will be taught in the school will be the mother tongue or the regional language. Then the second language will be English or any other modern Indian language in the Hindi speaking state, and English or Hindi in the non-Hindi speaking state. So remember, it is Hindi here for non-Hindi speaking states in the south. The third language can be English or any other modern Indian language for both Hindi and non-Hindi speaking state, for example French, German, etc. Now, what are the arguments in the favor of creation of such one nation, one language? First is that if we refer to the UNESCO, it says that how in our country there are more than 1600 languages. So India is a multi-linguistic country, and that basically kind of just hamper any kind of cohesion among the country in various circumstances. For example, there might be certain students who are coming from the southern state, and you guys are able to avail this lecture which is being delivered by me because both of us can understand one language, and that is English. If you guys were speaking Kannada, let's say for example Salpa Kannada Gottu, but in that particular case, obviously I cannot kind of converse with you very fluently in Kannada altogether. So we could have had a language barrier. Thus, a uniform language facilitates the exchange of ideas and intermingling of society. For that purpose, we can actually take the example of Neel Darpan. Neel Darpan, which was written by Deen Bandhu Mitra, which basically kind of highlighted the grievances which were being faced by the indigo planters, specifically in the region of Bengal. But it only got, this issue only got the national attention when it was actually translated into English by Madhusudan Datta. And that basically kind of everyone got aware about the exploitation of the indigo planters. Everyone raised their voice. So this principle of fraternity among each other, common brotherhood among each other, as enshrined in Article 51A, that can also be upheld under one nation, one language. And it can thus curb the growing regionalism or son of soil doctrine which we often see. Right? For example, when the people are going in the region of Karnataka or Bangalore, so they are being forced to speak in a particular language. So all of these kind of issue, the son of soil doctrine, where the people's identity kind of derives or subjugates from the nation level to a region level, that can also curb down. But at the same time, remember that there is an argument in favor of multilingual education as well. And that is, Constitution itself upholds the principle of linguistic diversity by identifying 22 scheduled language which we have. And there is a major argument that this one nation, one language is a European idea. Germany, German, Italian, Italy, right? So that is a European idea. Versus the idea of Vasudev Kutumbakam, that is whole earth is one family, and in one family all 5 fingers are never same. The World Bank says that how in our country there are 35% people who are migrant workers, and they kind of enjoy their right of freedom of movement under Article 19 of the Constitution. So now if we create, let's say for example, such one language which will be imposed, that can actually kind of hamper the migration of the people from one region to other region. So economic disintegration can take place. And it was this language imposition issue itself, the imposition of Urdu as a language on the eastern Pakistan, where the majority of the population used to speak Bengali, that led to the partition of Pakistan and the creation of Bangladesh in the year of 1971. Thus, the article itself suggests that how we should actually kind of adopt or promote multilingualism, and for that purpose what we can do. First of all, why we are limiting this multilingual teaching only to the affiliated school? What about those children whose mother tongue finds no place in the school with no books or teacher? Or those children whose mother tongue has no script yet? Thus, there is a requirement of teacher, regular, properly trained ones, and they have a kind of ensuring right teacher-student ratio as well. We need to create study material in the regional languages, such as for example, Bodo, Santhali, Maithili, etc. And we can create a kind of a council for scientific and technical terminology council, which can actually kind of translates the various scientific terms in English in the regional languages for the further dissemination of scientific knowledge in the regional language. Then the initiatives like for example Kashi Tamil Sangam or Ek Bharat Shresth Bharat, that actually kinds of promote the linguistic diversity and kind of promotes fraternity among the people as well. And we need to keep the idea of Shashi Tharoor, who basically said that how our Indian culture is a vegetarian thali, where there are several dishes distinct from each other served in one plate. But the whole enjoyment of this plate can be only if you are eating all of that together and never in isolation. Use that in your conclusion. We move forward to the next news, where we are going to talk about the interesting concept of a rising third nuclear age. What does the article say? The article says that how the world has entered the third nuclear age, where the Israel's recent bombing of Iran, supposedly to address the nuclear threat posed by the regime, actually contravenes the diplomatic norms and completely goes against the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. What is this Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was signed in the year of 1968? So that basically constituted a major breakthrough during the first age or first nuclear age. The first nuclear age basically started with the nuclear arsenal war, which started developing between USA and USSR amidst the Cold War period. So this Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and technology and to promote the peaceful use of nuclear energy, which currently has 190 member states. Keep this in mind that the non-parties to treaty are our country as well: India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea and South Sudan. India in the year of 1974 conducted the Operation Smiling Buddha, where we actually kind of conducted the first nuclear test. It was detonated on the army base in the Rajasthan Pokhran test range called as Pokhran 1, 1974. And it was the first confirmed nuclear test by a nation outside the 5 permanent members of United Nations Security Council. So in response to that, the Nuclear Supplier Group 1974 was created, which is basically a kind of a multilateral export control regime, which currently has 48 members and the 5 permanent members of United Nations Security Council as well. Just name them down in the comment box. The idea is that it basically kind of follows a trigger list which has been created by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And these are basically the items which shall be exported to the non-nuclear state only if they are signatory to this Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Thus, they act as a kind of a safeguard which is implemented by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Does India member of Nuclear Supplier Group? No. Why? Because India has not signed to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Remember this. Okay? Then India officially declared itself to be a nuclearly powered country in the year of 1998, when we actually conducted a very prominent operation called as Operation Shakti, in which there was basically kind of a huge bombs which we used, the atom bombs, hydrogen bombs and sub-kiloton device altogether, making ourselves the 6th country to join the nuclear club. However, in this second nuclear age, there was much more impetus on use of nuclear energy as a kind of a renewable energy. And that we have done as well. We have also created various operational nuclear power plants in our country, such as for example, Narora, Khakrapar, Tarapur, Kaiga nuclear power plant in the state of Karnataka, the Kundankulam nuclear power plant often in the news. So that has been the kind of the second age of the nuclear kind of the arsenal. But now there is development of the third nuclear age. The article suggests that how the attitude toward proliferation and deterrence began to harden with China's nuclear buildup, specifically in the mid-2000s, which basically coincided with deteriorating relation between Russia and the West as well. So since then, look at the geopolitical development. Russia has threatened nuclear use over Ukraine. Europe is also reconsidering how to deter Russia in the wake of the waning American support for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Then Trump and our Prime Minister, they perceive a nuclear element to the recent hostilities between India and Pakistan as well. Idea is that as per a recent report which has been released by Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI report 2025, it has stated that how nearly all of the 9 nuclear armed countries, including India and Pakistan, continued intensive nuclear modernization program in 2024. For example, our country's stored warheads, nuclear warheads, increased from 172 to 180. Pakistan's has remained 170. US has currently 1,770 deployed nuclear warheads and 1,930 stored ones. China has 24 deployed, 576 stored. All of this nuclear arsenal is building in the wake of the kind of the treaty which is called as Strategic Offensive Arms Treaty, START Treaty, which was signed between USSR and USA to kind of curb down their nuclear warheads to a certain number. Keep this in mind that this treaty is going to expire in 2026, and thus this particular third nuclear age is actually going to be a matter of concern. So keep this in mind. We move forward to the next news, where we are going to read about a very important concept which has actually featured in the news. That is, you guys might have heard about the tragedy which occurred, and that was the Air India Boeing 787 Dreamliner crash in Ahmedabad. After which several international aviation agencies has actually arrived at the spot to participate in the investigation of the accident, such as, for example, United States National Transportation Safety Board or United Kingdom Civil Aviation Authority. The question which shall come in your mind is that why? Why are foreign agencies involved in investigating an aviation disaster that has took place on the soil of our country? The reason for that is that India, along with the countries like US and UK, is a signatory to a convention called as Chicago Convention, also called as New Convention on International Civil Aviation, which was signed on 7th of December 1944, and it basically lays down the rule for airspace aircraft registration as well as safety. It was signed by 52 states in 1944, remember, including India. And that basically led to what? The development of the International Civil Aviation, which became the International Civil Aviation Organization in the year of 1947. Currently, 193 countries has basically member of this Chicago Convention. And it has 19 annexes which contains the basic standard, such as, for example, Annex 30, which basically provide for international protocol for investigating aircraft accidents and serious incidents. There is Chapter 5, which provides for that the goal is not to blame or put liability on the country on where the accident has taken place, like for example India, rather to improve the aviation safety. And in any such investigation, there shall be an ensured participation by other countries if state of registry, operator and manufacturer belongs to other countries. For example, in this particular case, the airline in the news, that is Air India Boeing 787, is actually developed by the state of USA. So the USA agency is also in our country. The larger investigation is actually done by the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a specialized agency of United Nations, whose headquarters is in Montreal, Canada, which actually defines the protocol for air accident investigation, following which these agencies, such as for example United Kingdom Civil Aviation Authority or United States National Transportation Safety Board, is conducting the investigation in our country. So keep these provisions in your mind and we move forward to the next news, where we'll try to understand that how does the synthetic aperture radar actually works. So it is basically a way to make sharp pictures even when it is dark or cloudy. Basically it is using what? The kind of the radio waves. And these radio waves are able to kind of penetrate any cloud, any kind of foggy system. Even at certain areas, it can also penetrate the grounds altogether. So the idea is that it basically provides a much sharper picture. So instead of using the visible light like a regular camera, this synthetic aperture radar sends out microwave pulses, as you guys can see here, and record the echoes that bounce back from the ground, ocean, ice or building. Then clever signal processing turn those echoes into a kind of a detailed imaging. Let's try to understand how it works. So usually the longer a physical antenna is, the better the resolution. So the idea is, let's say for example, if you want to cover a complete image of a football, you guys are required to have an antenna of around, let's say 47 meter. But that much we cannot say. Let's say for example, we have to image not only a football field but the whole earth altogether. How to do that? So what we do, and this large antenna is hard to build and maintain. So in this synthetic aperture radar, a small antenna is carried on a moving platform like a satellite from path A to path B, right? And as a result, each echo is recorded at a slightly different position. By stitching them together with a precise timing and phase information, software can render a kind of a meter-long images with a very small kind of antenna all together. Idea is that the different type of materials, what it can kind of measure, different materials like soil, vegetation, water, metals, all of them reflect microwaves differently, thus allowing the synthetic aperture radar to detect changes invisible to the optical sensors. So it is basically using the various frequencies of here the microwaves, even the infrared waves at certain frequency. So USA's space agency NASA has said that the NASA-ISRO joint mission, that is SAR, NISAR mission, had arrived at the ISRO's spaceport in Sriharikota. And this is going to scan nearly all of the Earth land and ice surfaces, remember, twice every 12 days, thus kind of generating an unprecedented amount of information. So keep this NISAR mission in your mind. Remember that how the kind of synthetic aperture radar uses the microwaves to kind of create these images, and we move forward to the last news of the day, where we are going to read about a very important geographical location which is in the news, and that is the Strait of Hormuz. Why it is in the news? It is in the news because the global energy market has now set its eyes on the ongoing tussle between the Israel and Iran conflict in the West Asian region, which is very critical to the international oil and the gas flow. Any such disruption in the West Asian oil and gas exports could actually lead to surge in oil and gas prices in the international market, and thus lead to what? The consumer price index combined inflation in our country as well. The products are going to become much costlier. For example, the Strait of Hormuz port closure can lead to the crude oil prices surging to around $120, and which may actually negatively impact the Indian economy. So first of all, try to understand this strategic location of Strait of Hormuz, which you guys can see here, which basically connects this Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. The idea is that the basin countries which lies around this Strait of Hormuz is Iran, as you guys can see here, the Oman is here, and the UAE. 25% of the global oil consumption and 33% of the natural gases passes through this state. Even when Babur was writing Baburnama, he basically talks about that how the almonds from Fargana was basically a kind of a principality in the region of Uzbekistan at that point of time. So, and Fargana was basically the kind of the region from where Babur actually came from, his father actually. So the idea is that Babur writes that how from that region of Fargana, the almonds were actually taken to this Strait of Hormuz to actually sold to the other countries. And he talks about the importance of Strait of Hormuz at that point of time, right? How much it is important for our country. First of all, we are 85% dependent on the import of oil. From this Strait of Hormuz, we actually kind of procure 40% of our crude imports and 54% of our liquefied natural gas. So it is going to be very critical for our country, and we actually should try or hope that this particular conflict which is taking place between Iran and Israel shall actually deter in the coming days, so that the inflation does not take place in our economy. With this, we have reached to the end of our discussion today. Do not forget to attend the questions at the end of the video and test your knowledge. We will meet in a very interesting discussion very soon. Till then, all the very best for your preparation, and thank you.